She walked in at 7:42 in the morning, first day, new title. Every eye in the room watching without watching. She saw him immediately, a man asleep at the center console, head down, surrounded by 24 screens, all of them live, all of them running, all of them saying something she didn't stop to read. She didn't ask questions. She read the badge on the desk, said the name out loud, and in front of every engineer on that floor, in front of people who had worked beside this man for years, she ended his employment before he could finish a single sentence. He tried to say something. She cut him off. He tried again. She turned away. The room went completely silent. Before he walked out, he stopped, looked at one person across the floor, said 4 words, just 4. Nobody thought much of it. Nobody except the man who said them understood that those 4 words were the only thing standing between this company and a catastrophe that was already counting down. What was on those screens? What he had been doing there for 2 days straight? What was about to happen the moment the wrong person touched the wrong key? Nobody in that building knew. Not yet. Rebecca Sanchez had been awake since 5. Not because she was nervous. She didn't do nervous, she did prepared. And she had spent the last 3 weeks preparing for this exact morning, her first as CEO of NovaBridge Financial. She dressed carefully. Dark blazer, simple jewelry. Nothing that said I'm trying too hard. Everything that said I belong here. She had earned this. That was the thing people didn't understand. They looked at her 29 years old, granddaughter of the founder, and they made assumptions. She had spent the better part of her career dismantling those assumptions, one result at a time. 3 years in investment analysis. 2 years restructuring a mid-sized logistics firm that everyone else had written off. A track record that existed on its own terms. But this was different. NovaBridge Financial wasn't a turnaround project. It wasn't a case study. It was a living, breathing machine that processed corporate payments and wire transfers for thousands of American businesses every single day, without pause. Her grandfather, Donald Thomas, had built it from nothing over 4 decades. And now, because his heart had decided enough was enough, it belonged to her. The pressure to prove she was more than a family name was enormous. She felt it every morning when she opened her eyes. So she arrived early. Not to her office. She went straight to the operations floor. No scheduled tour, no prepared presentations from department heads. She wanted to see the company without filters, without the version people assembled for someone they were trying to impress. The elevator opened at 7:42 a.m. Cold air hit her immediately. The floor ran cold, always. Something about server heat management. She made a mental note to ask about it later. She walked through rows of monitors, engineers finishing overnight shifts. The low hum of systems doing what systems do. Everything looked controlled, organized, functional. She was almost to the end of the floor when she stopped. There was a man asleep at the center console. His head rested on his forearms. His shirt was wrinkled in the way that suggested he had been in it for a very long time. Around him 24 monitors, all active, scrolling alerts, status indicators blinking amber, log output moving fast enough that reading it would take real effort. She looked at his badge lying fey up on the desk. Brian Thompson, Senior Systems Engineer. She looked at the monitors again. She didn't know what the numbers meant. She didn't know what the amber indicators were tracking. She didn't know what the log output was saying. What she knew was what she was looking at, a person, asleep, at the most sensitive station in the company's infrastructure. On the morning of her first day, to Rebecca Sanchez. This was not a mystery to be solved. It was a symbol of exactly the kind of culture she had come here to end. She said his name clearly. Brian Thompson jolted upright. For several seconds, he was genuinely somewhere else, head heavy, eyes dry and burning, a low ringing in his ears that wouldn't clear. His body was fighting toward consciousness like a man surfacing from deep water. He hadn't chosen to fall asleep. That was the thing. He had been sitting there watching the logs, waiting for the morning shift to arrive, planning exactly what he was going to say to whoever he could get in front of first. And then the next thing he knew, someone was saying his name. He blinked. The room came into focus. He recognized her immediately. He had seen the announcement 3 days ago. The photo, the name, the title. He understood exactly what he was looking at. And he also understood that he had maybe 30 seconds to say something that mattered. He started talking before she could continue. You need to hear what I have to say about the core payment cluster. Please just give me 2 minutes. Rebecca didn't hesitate. This company does not pay anyone to sleep on the job. Her voice was level, not angry, controlled. Every engineer within earshot stop moving, security collect his access card, HR initiate termination. Immediately, Brian looked at her, not with panic, not with desperation, with the specific, exhausted urgency of a man watching something preventable happen in slow motion. He tried once more. If someone restarts the system, I've said everything I'm going to say. A security officer was already moving toward him. Brian looked across the floor. Timothy Clark was standing near the secondary console, 27 years old, one of the sharper engineers on the overnight team. He had been there all night. He knew Brian had been there all night. He knew something significant had been happening because you don't spend 48 hours at a console for a routine escalation. Timothy said nothing. He would think about that moment for a long time afterward. Brian removed his badge slowly. No argument. He didn't list what he had done. He didn't ask for anything. He looked at Timothy, spoke quietly enough to be heard by 3 or 4 people nearby. Do not restart it. Someone assumed it was bitterness. The kind of thing a man says when he's angry and wants to feel like he left something behind. Rebecca didn't register it as meaningful at all. She had already filed the morning under necessary leadership. First signal. New era. Brian Thompson walked to the elevator and didn't look back. You had to understand what NovaBridge actually was, not what the website said. Not the pitch deck Donald Thomas used when he took the company to its first round of institutional investors 12 years ago. What it actually was. NovaBridge Financial processed corporate payments for thousands of American businesses. High-speed wire transfers. Transaction authentication. The kind of infrastructure that nobody thinks about until it stops working, and when it stops working, the consequences arrive fast and they arrive hard. A 1-hour outage could mean tens of millions in losses. The reputational damage took years longer than that to repair. The system never paused. It ran every hour of every day. Weekends, holidays, 3 in the morning on Christmas Eve. Always running, always processing. The infrastructure wasn't just part of the business. It was the business. Everything else, the executive floor, the marketing materials, the glass-walled conference rooms, was window dressing built around it. Brian Thompson had worked inside that infrastructure for 9 years. He was 34 years old. His title was Senior Systems Engineer, which communicated almost nothing about what he actually did. The title suggested someone who managed systems. What Brian did was something closer to carrying them. He understood NovaBridge's architecture the way a surgeon understands a patient they've operated on a dozen times, not just the textbook version, but the real version. The version that had evolved through years of emergency patches and partial upgrades and decisions. Made it 2 in the morning when the right solution wasn't available. And something had to work now. He knew the API layers from 2014 that 3 successive CTOs had promised to modernize. He knew the failover logic that had been rewritten by hand during a cascading outage in 2019, rewritten by him, at 3 in the morning, alone on the floor, with no blueprint and no backup. He knew the interdependencies that existed, only because someone once built a fix for a problem that no longer existed, but whose removal would cause something worse. He was the institutional memory that NovaBridge had never bothered to formally document. To the organization, he was a line on an org chart. To the system itself, he was the only person who knew where all the load-bearing walls were. Outside the office, Brian Thompson was a father. That was the more important fact. That was the thing that shaped everything else about him. His daughter Nicole was 7 years old, small for her age, quiet in the way that children are quiet when they've learned to observe. She had a stuffed rabbit named Biscuit that went most places with her, a little worn now, one ear slightly looser than the other from years of being carried. She was the kind of kid who occasionally said things that made adults go still. Because what she said was too precise for a 7-year-old, Brian's wife had died 3 years ago. Her name was Sarah. She had been a network security analyst, smart in the specific, methodical way that Brian was smart, which was probably why they worked. The illness came fast and stayed long, and took her before either of them had prepared for it to. Since then, Brian had rebuilt his life around 2 fixed points. Keep Nicole cared for. Keep the job stable enough to make that possible. He didn't cultivate allies inside the company. He didn't know how to perform the small social rituals that turned colleagues into advocates. He showed up. He did the work. He went home. That was the shape of his life. And he had made a quiet kind of peace with it. The evening before everything started, Brian came home at 6:15. Nicole was at the kitchen table, working through a page of long division. She had finished 7 of the 10 problems and was staring at the 8th with the focused frustration of someone who knows they're close but can't find the step they're missing. Brian dropped his bag by the door, washed his hands, sat down across from her. He didn't correct the problem. He asked her a question instead. "What are you trying to find when you divide?" Nicole thought about it, chewed her pencil eraser, then said, "How many groups, right? So what groups are you making?" She worked it through, found the answer herself, wrote it down with the satisfaction of someone who did the thing, not just got the answer. They ate dinner together, scrambled eggs and toast. The meal Brian had made at least 400 times since Sarah died, because it was the one thing he could make reliably, and Nicole had never once complained about it. Nicole talked about Biscuit. Apparently a classmate had borrowed the rabbit for show and tell and returned it with one ear slightly bent. She said she fixed it, Nicole said. But she didn't fix it. Does Biscuit seem upset about it? Nicole considered this seriously. Biscuit doesn't get upset. Biscuit just waits, Brian smiled. Not the kind of smile you perform. The real kind. The kind that happens without you deciding to. He cleaned the dishes. Read 2 chapters of a book to Nicole after she brushed her teeth. Sat in the doorway until her breathing slowed and steadied. Then he went back to the kitchen table with his laptop and found what he found. It was 11:47 at night when Brian saw it. He had been doing a routine check on the enterprise payment authentication logs. The kind of thing he did every few days, not because anyone asked him to, but because he had learned years ago that systems like this one didn't fail dramatically. They failed gradually. And the only way to catch gradual failure was to look at the right things at the right time. The alert didn't exist. Nothing had fired. No red indicators, no system flags. What Brian saw was a pattern, a cluster of irregular requests appearing in the high-volume enterprise processing queue. Low frequency, slow rhythm, spaced out in a way that mimicked legitimate internal traffic closely enough that the automated filters had dismissed them entirely. But the timing was wrong. Not wrong in a way that was easy to explain. Wrong in the way that a piece of music is wrong when a single note is off pitch. You can't always say which note, but you feel the dissonance before you identify it. Brian had been listening to this system's rhythm for 9 years. He knew what it sounded like when everything was working. This wasn't that. He traced the activity backward. It took him 2 hours. Followed the thread from the processing queue into the authentication layer. Then deeper into a secondary relay node that handled a subset of multi-state corporate payment verifications, a low-priority component. The kind of thing that processed a narrow slice of traffic and didn't get much attention because it had never caused problems. Someone had gotten inside it. Not violently, not with a battering ram. More like a lockpick, slow, patient, methodical. They had been in that secondary node for days, possibly longer, testing what it could reach. Mapping the connections between that low-priority relay and the more central systems it touched. They weren't trying to cause damage. Not yet. They were learning the system, building a map, waiting for the right moment to use what they'd found. Brian sat still for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called his direct supervisor. The supervisor's name was Victor Hayes. Not a bad man, not a dishonest one. Just a man who had been doing the middle management version of the job for long enough that his instincts had shifted from what is right to what is safe. Victor listened to Brian's summary, asked a few clarifying questions, then said what he was actually thinking, dressed in the language he used when he wanted to say something, without quite saying it. Brian. The new CEO starts tomorrow morning. If we file a major incident report tonight based on patterns you noticed and it turns out to be nothing, or something minor, you understand how that lands, right? Give it another day. Keep monitoring. Don't create alarm before we have something confirmed. Brian understood exactly what Victor was saying. He was saying, be quiet and hope. Brian said he would continue monitoring. He didn't say he would stop there. The moment he ended the call, he started working. He began building isolation barriers around the segments he had identified as compromised. Manual redirect layers designed to absorb the suspicious traffic without triggering visible failures containing the problem while leaving the system operational. 1 year. He hot-patched individual nodes the way you shore up a sinking structure when you don't have proper materials. With whatever is at hand, applied with enough care to hold, the difficulty was that the infrastructure was old, not old like outdated, old like accumulated, layers of upgrades on top of patches, on top of workarounds, on top of the original architecture. There was no clean version to restore, no safe moment to take it offline and fix it properly. The only option was to work on the live system, the one processing millions of dollars in transactions every hour, with no safety net and no margin for significant error. It was like performing surgery on a patient who couldn't be anesthetized. He worked through the night. His colleagues on the overnight shift saw him there, nodded when they passed, assumed he was managing a routine escalation. Nobody asked. Nobody understood. Brian drank whatever coffee was available, ate from the vending machine down the hall crackers, a granola bar, something in a yellow wrapper he didn't bother to identify. He changed his shirt in the technical staff bathroom near midnight. He didn't leave the floor. By the following afternoon, he had built a functional defense. Not perfect. Nothing about it was elegant. But it was working, absorbing the irregular traffic, keeping the most sensitive payment systems insulated, maintaining the appearance of normal operations, while preventing the intrusion from advancing deeper. The problem was that it wasn't a permanent fix. It was a structure, built by one person in his head, adapted in real time to a live system under threat. It existed because Brian Thompson existed and was present and awake. Late in the second night, he found something worse. He had been doing a deep trace on the compromised relay, trying to understand exactly what the attackers had managed to map from their position when he found it. Buried in the processing cluster, a delayed activation mechanism, a piece of code that sat completely dormant under normal operating conditions, invisible to standard monitoring. Would never trigger on its own, but it would trigger automatically if someone performed a standard system restart. Brian sat with that for a moment. A system restart was routine maintenance. Supervisors used it constantly to clear memory accumulation, to resynchronize services after congestion, to handle a dozen ordinary situations that came up in the daily life of a system like this one. If anyone performed that restart without knowing about the trigger, every temporary defensive layer Brian had constructed would collapse instantly. The dormant pathway would open. The attack would enter its active phase, and it would happen not gradually but all at once during whatever processing window happened to be running at that moment. He wrote it all down, nesponted, log summaries, patch annotations, a description of the trigger and exactly how it worked. A warning in plain language at the bottom of the last page, written in font slightly larger than the rest: do not restart core services under any circumstances. This is not a performance issue. This is a staged attack waiting to be triggered. Call me first. He wrote his phone number below it. He saved everything to the internal repository folder, where the technical team stored working documentation. He would hand-deliver a summary to executive leadership the moment the morning shift arrived. He would bypass Victor if he had to. He would stand in someone's doorway and make them listen. He had a plan. He sat at the primary console, watching the log display, waiting for the overnight team to come through the door. He put his head down for one moment. One moment. Rebecca Sanchez had been preparing for this role for 3 weeks, not emotionally preparing. Strategically preparing. There was a difference. She had reviewed financial reports, operational audits, and client retention data. She had read every internal review from the past 2 years. She had mapped the organizational structure, identified the decision-making bottlenecks, and made a list of the cultural patterns she intended to address in her first month. She was not walking into Novabridge blind. What she was walking into, and this was the thing she couldn't have prepared for, because it required experience she didn't yet have, was a complex, aging operational machine that ran on institutional knowledge that had never been formally documented. The gap between what the org chart said and what was actually holding the company together was enormous. She didn't know that yet. She would know it by noon. Her grandfather, Donald Thomas, had built Novabridge over 40 years. When his cardiologist told him the stress had to stop, Donald had spent 2 months considering who to hand it to. He chose Rebecca not because she was family. He was too clear-eyed for sentiment to be the deciding factor. He chose her because she was the sharpest person he knew, and because he believed that sharpness could learn whatever it didn't yet understand. He had underestimated how much that learning would cost. Rebecca's session with department heads that morning was structured and unambiguous. She outlined expectations. She described the kind of organization she intended to build: accountable, efficient, direct. She used the phrase moving from comfortable to accountable more than once. Some people in those rooms felt energized by what she was describing. Others felt a formless unease they couldn't name. Nobody in those rooms knew enough about what was happening 2 floors below them to interrupt her. In the technical department, the atmosphere was heavier. A few engineers who had worked alongside Brian for years were quietly furious and equally powerless. Some of them had already opened his repository folder. They could see that something significant was there: warnings, patch references, time-stamped logs. But Brian's documentation style was compressed. It was written for himself at speed under pressure. Reading it without context was like being handed a map in a language you mostly understood. You could see it was a map. You couldn't always tell what it was a map of. Timothy Clark had opened the folder twice. He had read the final warning, the one in the larger font, and felt something cold move through him. He knew what those 4 words had meant when Brian said them on the way out. He understood, at the level of instinct, that this wasn't bitterness. He didn't act on it. He told himself he didn't have enough information. He told himself someone more senior would find it. He told himself a lot of things, in the way people do when they have already made a decision and are looking for reasons it was reasonable. The morning passed. Rebecca moved through her schedule with focused energy. The dashboards, when she glanced at them between meetings, looked manageable. The system was running. The numbers on the summary reports were within normal range. If nothing had broken in Brian's absence, she reasoned there had been nothing urgent to begin with. That reasoning felt solid. It was about to cost her everything. Brian reached his apartment in a state that wasn't quite anything. Not anger. He didn't have the energy for anger. Not grief, exactly. More like the specific hollowness of a person who has given everything they had to a problem and has just been told without anyone saying the words that it wasn't wanted. He had not been given a single opportunity to explain. That was the part that stayed with him on the drive home. Not the humiliation of being fired in front of the floor. Not the loss of the job itself. It was the 4 seconds. That's all he had needed. 4 seconds to say the words that mattered. There is a trigger in the payment cluster. Do not restart the system. 4 seconds. He hadn't gotten them. His phone had messages from a few colleagues, people checking in, people who had been there and didn't know what to say. He left them unread. He didn't know what he would say back. He unlocked the apartment door. Nicole was at the kitchen table, biscuit tucked under one arm, math worksheet in front of her. She looked up when he came in, 7 years old, and she looked at his face the way someone looks at weather, reading it, deciding what it means, adjusting accordingly. She didn't ask why he was home early. She said, "Are you hungry?" Brian managed something close to a smile. "Not right now, bug." He sat on the edge of the sofa, meant to take off his jacket. Didn't. Meant to check the remote monitoring dashboard on his laptop, the one running quietly in the corner of his screen, still showing Nova Bridge's system status even now. Didn't do that either. He placed the open laptop on the cushion beside him. And that was the last thing he did before the sofa took him. He didn't choose to sleep. He just wasn't awake anymore. Nicole watched her father for a moment. She was 7, but she understood certain things that 7-year-olds understand when they have been paying careful attention to the adults around them for long enough. She understood that her father hadn't been sleeping properly. She had heard him leave the night before last very early, the sound of the front door clicking shut in the dark. She had heard him come home last night for only a few hours before leaving again. She understood that something was wrong at his work. He had told her that much. "There's a problem I need to fix, bug. It might take a little while." He had promised he would rest when it was done. He hadn't rested. Nicole set biscuit carefully on the arm of the sofa, near her father's head. She went to the closet in the hallway and got the blue blanket, the soft one, not the heavy one, and brought it back. She spread it over him as gently as she could. He didn't move. His laptop screen pulsed quietly beside him. Green and amber indicators, numbers scrolling. A live feed from a system that was still, for the moment, holding. Nicole looked at it for a second. Then she went back to the kitchen table and picked up her pencil. She had 7 problems done. 3 to go. She worked on them quietly, the way she had learned to work when something nearby needed to be undisturbed. The apartment was very still. Outside, Columbus went about its morning traffic. Someone's lawnmower 2 buildings over, the distant sound of a delivery truck. Inside the apartment on Maplewood Drive, a little girl did her math homework, and her father slept beside a screen showing the slow, quiet deterioration of the system he had spent 2 days keeping alive. He had written the warning. He had left the number. He had done everything a person could do with the access and authority he had been given, which, in the end, had not been enough. The clock on the microwave read 10:48 a.m. On the other side of the city, in the operations center of Novabridge Financial, a supervisor named George White was settling in for the afternoon shift. The dashboard in front of him looked manageable, normal even. He had a coffee, a checklist, and a routine that he had followed without incident for 11 years. He had no idea what was coming, and Brian Thompson, the one person who could have told him, was asleep on a sofa on Maplewood Drive, with a blue blanket, and a stuffed rabbit and a daughter who had decided, quietly and without being asked, to protect his rest for as long as she could. The laptop screen pulsed, green amber, green for now. The system looked fine. That was the thing that made it so dangerous. After Brian Thompson walked out of the building at 8:04 in the morning, the operations floor continued doing what operations floors do. Engineers rotated stations. Coffee got made and forgotten. The overnight team handed off to the day team with the usual combination of tired shorthand and half-finished notes. The dashboards were green, mostly green. A few amber indicators here and there, nothing outside the normal range of a system this size and this age. Transaction queues moving at expected speeds. Authentication tokens cycling cleanly. The summary numbers that landed in department inboxes at 9 a.m. looked like every other Tuesday. To anyone reading those numbers without knowing what was underneath them, the message was simple. Everything is fine. Rebecca Sanchez read those numbers between her 8:30 meeting and her 9:15 meeting. She noted them the way you note something that confirms what you already believe. The system was running, the company was functional, the decision she had made at 7:42 had not caused any visible disruption. That felt, to her, like evidence. She was wrong about what it was evidence of. What those numbers actually showed was Brian Thompson's work. The isolation barriers he had built over 48 hours were still running, still absorbing the irregular traffic, still routing the suspicious requests into contained channels where they couldn't reach the core payment layer, still performing the dozen small interventions that kept the intrusion from advancing. The system looked fine because Brian had made it look fine. He was no longer in the building, but his work was still there quietly, invisibly holding, like a wall that's been load-bearing so long that no one remembers it's a wall. They just think that's how the ceiling stays up. Rebecca's 9:15 was with the head of client relations. Her 10:30 was with the CTO, a man named Franklin Briggs, strategically sharp, operationally thin in the specific areas that were about to matter most. Her noon meeting was a full department head roundtable, where she laid out her first-month priorities in language that was precise and unambiguous. She talked about accountability, structural efficiency, the importance of transparency in reporting chains. Some people left that meeting feeling genuinely energized. Rebecca had a way of making direction feel like momentum. Others left with something they couldn't quite name. A low-level discomfort. The sense that something was sitting just outside their line of sight. Nobody in that room had a clear enough picture of the technical infrastructure to say why. In the technical department, the atmosphere was different. It had been different since 8 a.m. A few engineers who had worked alongside Brian for years were carrying a particular kind of anger, the kind that has nowhere to go, because the people who should hear it are too far up the chain and too busy proving something to stop and listen. They had seen what happened on the floor that morning. They had watched a man try to say something important get cut off mid-sentence. They had stood there and said nothing, each of them, and now they were carrying that too. Marcus Webb had been on the overnight team. He'd gone home at 8:30, slept 4 hours, come back because he couldn't stop thinking. He sat at his station and opened Brian's repository folder. He had opened it twice already. He opened it again now. The files were dense. Brian's documentation style was compressed, written fast, written for himself. built from 9 years of shorthand that made complete sense if you had the context and partial sense if you didn't. Marcus had the context for about 60% of it. He could follow the patch references. He understood what the isolation barriers were doing. He could read the warning flags and know they were serious. What he couldn't fully reconstruct was the logic, the specific sequence of decisions Brian had made over 48 hours, the interdependencies he had identified, the exact architecture of the defense he had built. That knowledge lived in one place. It had walked out the front door 4 hours ago. Marcus scrolled to the bottom of the final document. The warning was still there, same as it had been every other time he'd read it. Do not restart core services under any circumstances. This is not a performance issue. This is a staged attack waiting to be triggered. Call me first. The phone number sat below it like a quiet accusation. Marcus had his own phone in his hand. He looked at the number. He looked at the door to the supervisor's office. He put his phone back in his pocket. He told himself he'd wait and see how the afternoon went. George White arrived for his shift at 11:30. 11 years on the operations floor. He knew this system the way a bus driver knows a route, every stop, every turn, every place where the road got a little rough. He was good at his job. Reliable. The kind of supervisor you wanted on a Tuesday afternoon when nothing unusual was happening. The key phrase being, when nothing unusual was happening. He poured his coffee. Reviewed the morning handoff notes. Saw nothing flagged. Checked the dashboard. Green. Mostly green. He nodded to Timothy Clark, who was back after a few hours of sleep, running on coffee and something that wasn't quite guilt but was adjacent to it. Quiet morning? George asked. Quiet morning, Timothy said. That was the last quiet thing either of them would say for a long time. The first sign was latency. At 12:31 p.m., the primary processing cluster started showing elevated response times. Not dramatically elevated. 3 seconds, where there should be fractions of a second. Transactions backing up in the queue the way cars back up at a light, not a crash. Just a slowdown. George White saw it at 12:34. He recognized it immediately. He had seen it 100 times. Memory accumulation in the processing layer, routine congestion that built up during high-volume windows and cleared cleanly with a standard service restart. He had run that restart more times than he could count. He pulled up the command interface. Timothy Clark was at the adjacent station. He saw what George was doing. Something moved through him, not quite alarm, not quite certainty. More like the echo of a voice. Do not restart it. He set his coffee down. George. George looked up. Brian told us not to restart it. George's expression shifted. Not dismissive, exactly. More like the face of a man processing a thing that doesn't fit into any category he has a procedure for. Brian was terminated this morning, he said. His access has been revoked. Whatever his reasons were, he said specifically. The system. Don't restart it, Timothy. George's voice was patient, final. The voice of someone who has made a decision and is not inviting further discussion. He's been terminated. His instructions don't carry authority here. He wasn't wrong according to any rule that existed on paper. That was the terrible thing. He wasn't wrong about the rule. He was only wrong about what the rule missed. Timothy looked at the command interface, looked at George, looked back at his own screen. He thought about saying more. He thought about pulling up Brian's file in the repository right then and reading the warning out loud. He thought about a lot of things. He didn't do any of them. Okay, he said. Quietly, almost not said at all, George executed the restart command at 12:47 p.m., right in the middle of the afternoon's second trading window. The processing peak of the business day. In the first 2 minutes, something happened that made it worse. The system appeared to improve times, dropped back to normal. Congestion cleared. The amber indicators went green. George exhaled and took a sip of his coffee. See, his body said. Just like always. Timothy watched the screens and didn't feel relief. He felt the specific dread of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop and not knowing when. It dropped at 12:51. The first sign was authentication tokens going asynchronous, not all at once. In waves. A cluster of transaction sessions suddenly reporting state mismatches, payments flagged as uninitialized, as if they had never been submitted. Corporate wire transfers showing as pending when they should have been confirmed and cleared 20 minutes ago. Timothy leaned forward. George set his coffee down. What had happened, what was happening right now in the milliseconds between their recognition and their response, was this. The moment the restart command executed, it cleared the memory state where Brian's temporary logic had been running. The isolation barriers evaporated, the manual redirect layers dissolved. The patch that Brian had hot applied to the authentication relay at 2 in the morning, 2 days ago, the one that had been silently rerouting suspicious traffic away from the core payment layer, was gone. The dormant trigger fired. It was quiet about it. No alarm, no dramatic cascade of red warnings, just a piece of code that had been waiting, patient and invisible, doing exactly what it had been designed to do. The pathway opened, and the attack, which had been sitting in controlled stillness for 2 days, while Brian Thompson worked against it, with everything, he had the attack entered its active phase. The monitors told the story in numbers, if you knew how to read them. Outbound transaction routing, the mechanism that directed completed payments to their verified destination networks, began behaving abnormally. A subset of corporate transfer instructions started being directed toward endpoints that existed outside NovaBridge's verified network. Not all transfers, not even most. A carefully chosen subset, high value, time-sensitive, the kind that moved fast and didn't trigger standard reconciliation checks until the end-of-day cycle. The reconciliation mechanism itself was failing. Silently. Not crashing, just returning incorrect status codes that looked like normal codes if you weren't checking the specific field where the discrepancy lived. Several high-value payment instructions entered a suspended state. Not completed. Not failed. Suspended. Sitting in a condition that was neither cleanly reversible nor easily explainable. By 1 p.m., 6 enterprise clients had called the main line asking about payment statuses. By 1:15, that number was 14. Engineers worked fast. They ran rollback standard procedure for system anomalies. The rollbacks didn't anchor correctly. They were targeting a system state that had never been formally documented. Brian's architecture, the one he had built live and by hand over 48 hours, existed only in the running system and in his head. There was no blueprint to restore to. They tried isolating affected nodes. The interdependencies that Brian had understood intuitively, the ones that made certain nodes load-bearing in ways that weren't obvious from standard documentation, were not mapped in any accessible place. Isolating one node cascaded into 3 others behaving unexpectedly. Marcus Webb pulled up Brian's repository folder on the main console screen. He read the technical notes aloud to the group of engineers gathered around him. The notes described what was happening with remarkable precision. That was the hardest part. Reading Brian's words written hours ago, before any of this had occurred, and seeing that he had known. He had mapped the failure mode they were currently living through. He had described it clearly enough that a room full of engineers could recognize it as accurate. Understanding it clearly enough to reverse it was a different thing entirely. Can we call him? The question came from a junior engineer near the back of the group. Young enough that the answer wasn't obvious to her, Marcus looked at the phone number at the bottom of Brian's document. He had looked at it twice this morning and put his phone back in his pocket. He didn't put it in his pocket this time. But before he could dial, the door to the operations center opened and Rebecca Sanchez walked in. She had been pulled out of a meeting. Her assistant had come to the conference room door and said 5 words. "You need to come now," with a face that made Rebecca stand up without asking why. She walked into the operations center and stopped. The room was transformed. The monitors were overwhelmingly red. Engineers moved between stations with the tight-bodied urgency of people who know exactly how serious a thing is, and are trying very hard not to say the scariest number out loud. Phone lines were lit up along the client management wall, more lines than Rebecca had ever seen active simultaneously. She had been in the building for 6 hours. She had been CEO for 6 hours. She looked at the screens, looked at the people, found the senior engineer closest to her. "What's happening?" The engineer, a 15-year veteran named Carl Peterson, turned from his console. His face was pale in the controlled way of someone who has decided to say the true thing regardless of consequence. "It looks like he was holding the entire system together by hand for 2 days," Carl said. "We just deactivated all the defensive layers he built. He didn't say a name. He didn't need to." Everyone in the room knew. Rebecca stood very still. "Can we fix it? We're working on it. Who understands his patch logic?" Pause. The kind of pause that is its own answer. No one understands all of it. He built it live. There's no complete documentation. Where's the CTO? Franklin Briggs was on a call with a board member. He arrived 12 minutes later. Rebecca watched his face as he assessed the screens and understood that his operational knowledge of the legacy infrastructure, which had never needed to be deep because there had always been Brian Thompson to handle, that depth was not going to be enough for what was in front of him now. She didn't say anything to him about that. She walked to an empty workstation and sat down. She opened Brian's repository folder. She read everything. She read it the way she read financial reports, completely, in order, without skipping. She followed the patch annotations even when she didn't fully understand them. She read the time-stamped logs. She read the warning flags. She read the description of the trigger. She read it all. And at the bottom of the final page, in the font that was slightly larger than the rest, she read the line that had been there all morning: "Do not restart core services under any circumstances. This is not a performance issue. This is a staged attack waiting to be triggered. Call me first." She looked at the phone number. She thought about 7:42 a.m. The monitors alive around him. The way he had tried to speak, not panicked, not defensive, but urgent in the specific way of someone carrying information that matters. The 4 words she had said before he could finish a sentence: "I've said everything I'm going to say." She picked up her phone. She called the number. It rang, and rang, and rang. She ended the call, tried again. Rang, rang, rang. She tried a third time. Nothing. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she stood up, walked to the coat rack by the door, picked up her keys, and left the building. The neighborhood was ordinary in the best sense of the word. Older construction. Trees that had been there long enough to have opinions about the sidewalk. People who lived here rather than performed living here. Rebecca drove through it and felt the gap between this street and the glass building she had just left. She found the address from HR records. It had taken her assistant 6 minutes and 2 different databases to confirm a current home address. Brian Thompson had never updated it after moving 18 months ago, and the emergency contact form on file was 2 years old. She had also called legal before leaving. Her in-house counsel had told her, in the careful language of someone whose job is to identify risk, that visiting a recently terminated employee's home was inadvisable from a liability standpoint. She had listened to that advice. She had understood it, and then she had gotten in her car. She stood outside the apartment building for a moment. A modest 2-story complex, brick, well-maintained in the practical sense, the kind of place where the parking lot was clean, but the landscaping wasn't trying to impress anyone. She went to the door listed on the records. Unit 14. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. Still nothing. She was reaching for her phone to try calling one more time when the door opened, and a child stood in the space it revealed, small. Dark hair, slightly disordered. A stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, worn, well-loved, one ear slightly bent. She looked up at Rebecca with the calm, assessing gaze of a child who has learned to read adult visitors quickly and has developed opinions about what different expressions mean. "Are you looking for my dad?" Rebecca didn't answer immediately. She had not known there was a child. That sounds like a simple thing, a fact that could have been easily discovered. But the reason she hadn't known was not a failure of research. It was the nature of who Brian Thompson was at work, a person who did not use his personal life as a credential, who did not mention his daughter in meetings, or put family photos at his station, or drop her name into conversations the way people do when they want to be seen as human by their colleagues. He was just the engineer, just the quiet one, the one nobody had thought to ask about. Nicole opened the door wider when she determined the woman outside didn't appear to be a threat. She had good instincts. Rebecca would think about that later, a 7-year-old with better instincts than the CEO who had fired her father without hearing a full sentence. Rebecca stepped inside. The apartment was small, clean, organized in the way of a person who has learned to be efficient with space because space is finite and so is time. A kitchen that showed signs of regular use. A table with a math worksheet and a pencil. A bookshelf where the books were actually read, spines creased, pages marked. On the sofa, Brian Thompson still in the clothes from this morning. Jacket still on. One shoe removed, the other still on his foot as if he had made it partway through the process of settling in and then simply stopped. A glass of water on the low table beside him, poured and forgotten, untouched. His laptop was open on the cushion beside him. Screen cycling through the remote monitoring dashboard, Nova Bridge's system status, live in real time. Even here, even now, he had the absolute stillness of a person who had not chosen to stop but had simply run out of everything. Rebecca stood in the center of the living room and looked at all of it. She looked at the careful economy of the space. The evidence of a life organized around necessity and love. Nothing wasted, nothing missing that mattered. The child's drawings held to the refrigerator with magnets. A small pair of sneakers by the door placed neatly. A library book on the kitchen counter with a bookmark in it, 2/3 through. She thought about the story she had told herself at 7:42 this morning. She had looked at a man asleep at a console and she had known with complete certainty, in approximately 10 seconds, what that image meant. Carelessness. Negligence. The exact kind of comfortable, unaccountable culture she had come to end. She had been so certain. She had been so completely, entirely wrong. Nicole lowered her voice the way children do when they know the sleep nearby is genuinely necessary. Daddy hasn't really slept. He said something bad was happening at work. He promised he'd rest after he fixed it. Rebecca heard those words land, not figuratively. Physically, somewhere in her chest. She stood there and let them arrive without trying to process them into something manageable. A 7-year-old girl. Keeping the blanket on her father. Doing her homework quietly. Waiting for him to wake up because he had promised to rest after he fixed it. He had been fixing it for 2 days. And then Rebecca Sanchez had walked into the building and taken the fix away from him. She asked Nicole softly whether she was alone. Nicole said a neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, from down the hall was coming over soon. She said her father had only fallen asleep after he got home. She said she hadn't woken him because he needed it. Rebecca nodded. She was not performing composure. She was simply in a place beyond the kind of feelings that show on your face. Nicole, she said quietly. I need to wake your dad, is that okay? Nicole looked at her for a moment, made whatever calculation she made. He's hard to wake up when he's like this, she said. You have to say his name a few times. It took 4 tries. Brian surfaced in stages the way deeply sleep-deprived people do, consciousness returning in layers rather than all at once. The first layer was physical, a sound, a voice, something pulling him back. The second was locational. This was his sofa, his apartment. The third was recognition. He opened his eyes and saw Rebecca Sanchez sitting in the chair across from him. His first expression was not anger. It wasn't surprise either. It was the specific exhaustion of a man who has been handed one more thing when he has nothing left to give, but who is not going to say so, because saying so doesn't change what needs to happen. He sat up slowly, didn't speak. His eyes were clear despite the exhaustion, the particular clarity of someone whose mind has never fully stopped working even while the body was down. Rebecca didn't arrange her words into something diplomatic. She didn't build toward it gradually. I didn't listen to you this morning. I fired you before I understood what was happening. I need to apologize for that. Brian looked at her. He didn't respond right away. Not strategically. Not because he was making her wait. He was just not yet in a place where words, even accurate ones, even deserved ones, changed the weight he was carrying. She continued because the situation didn't allow her to wait for a more comfortable moment. They restarted the system. It's failing. Nobody in the building understands your patch logic well enough to stop it. Brian closed his eyes, just for a moment, not shock, not the surprise of someone who hadn't seen this coming. Something heavier than that. The particular weight of being exactly right about something you had desperately hoped to be wrong about. He reached for the laptop beside him, opened it, pulled up the remote monitoring interface. He looked at the metrics for less than 60 seconds. Then he set the laptop back down. The numbers confirmed what her face had already told him. He didn't need to say that. She already knew it. He didn't stand up. He looked at Nicole first. Bug. Did you eat lunch, Nicole? I had the leftover pasta. All of it? Most of it. Your worksheet, did you finish it? 8 out of 10. Mrs. Patterson coming? She texted. She'll be here in 20 minutes. Something passed between them that had no words and didn't need any. The shorthand of 2 people who have been taking care of each other long enough that the language runs underneath speech. Then Brian looked at Rebecca. I'm going back, he said, because if this breach completes, real people get hurt. Customers, small businesses, workers who depend on those payment systems to make payroll, to pay vendors to keep their operations running. They didn't make the decision that allowed this to happen. They'll pay for it anyway. That's the reason I'm going, he paused. Not the apology, not the job. He stood, went to the bedroom, changed his shirt, took less than 2 minutes, came back, picked up his laptop and jacket. He stopped in front of Nicole. He crouched down to her level, said something quietly. She nodded. Then she held up Biscuit's paw, a wave Brian almost smiled. The real kind. Then he straightened up, looked at Rebecca, and walked to the door. They drove back to Novabridge Financial without speaking. There wasn't anything to say. There was only what came next. Brian Thompson walked into the operations center at 2:17 p.m. The room changed. There's a specific thing that happens in a group of people who have been managing a crisis beyond their capacity when the right person walks through the door. It's not celebration. It's not relief in the warm sense. It's something closer to the release of a breath that the whole room has been holding, a collective letting go of a tension that everyone had been pretending was manageable. Nobody cheered. Nobody said anything at all for a moment. Brian didn't acknowledge it. He walked directly to the primary console. Someone stood up from the chair without being asked. He sat down and started looking at screens. He didn't rush. He was methodical. He asked for 3 things in sequence: full log access, current architecture diagrams, and a verbal summary of every intervention the team had attempted since the restart. Marcus Webb gave him the summary. Spoke quickly, clearly, without editorializing. Listed every rollback they'd tried, every node isolation, every diagnostic they'd run. Brian listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Brian was quiet for 8 seconds. Rebecca counted them from the edge of the room where she stood, out of the way, watching. Then Brian began distributing the work. He put 5 engineers on isolating the anomalous outbound connections, not blocking them blindly, which would trigger visible failures, but carefully redirecting them into a controlled observation environment where they could be analyzed without doing more damage. He sent Marcus and 1 other engineer to construct a mirror pathway, tracking exactly where the redirected transaction data was going. He asked a 3rd group to prepare a controlled failover for the highest value processing queue. He asked someone from legal to contact the 3 largest enterprise clients, the ones whose accounts were most exposed, with a scripted, accurate message that acknowledged a temporary technical issue without triggering the contractual escalation clauses that would require mandatory regulatory notification. And he asked 1 person, Timothy Clark, to do a single thing: write down every command I give in order with the time. Nothing else. Just record it. Timothy nodded. He understood what that was. It was documentation, the thing that hadn't existed before. The thing that meant the next person wouldn't have to be Brian Thompson to understand what had happened here. The distribution of the work was its own kind of statement. Brian wasn't performing. He wasn't demonstrating mastery for an audience. He was executing a plan that had been forming in his head for 48 hours, adapting it in real time to a situation that had deteriorated further than he'd hoped. He understood this system the way only years of continuous, intimate contact produces. Not just how it was designed to function, how it had evolved the distance between the original architecture and what actually existed now, and what that distance meant when the system was under this kind of stress. He worked without narrating. He asked questions. He gave instructions. He waited for answers and adjusted. At 2:44, the anomalous outbound routing was severed from its connection to the core payment layer. The subset of transactions that had been redirected toward unverified endpoints stopped moving. At 3:01, 3 suspended high-value corporate transfers were isolated and quarantined. The funds were confirmed as still within Novabridge's verified network, not transferred out. Not yet. At 3:19, Brian made 17 specific changes to the authentication configuration. Each one closed a door the attackers had opened. Each one removed a piece of the infrastructure they had built for themselves inside Novabridge's system. At 3:31, the authentication layer restabilized. At 3:38, Brian ran the full diagnostic sequence and watched the results come back clean. He sat back in the chair. The room was very quiet. Then Carl Peterson, standing at the adjacent console, said quietly, to no one in particular, "It's holding," and the room released that breath. Rebecca felt it leave her in a wave that was almost physical tension she hadn't known she was carrying until it was gone. Her hands, she noticed, had been pressed flat against the side of her thighs for the last hour. She let them relax. George White. standing near the back of the room, looked at the floor. He had not said much since Brian walked in. He would say less before the day was over. Timothy Clark was writing, still writing. The log of Brian's commands in order, with timestamps. 3 pages already. He wrote without stopping. He didn't look up, but he wrote carefully. The way you write something you want to make sure is legible later. The way you write something you want to make sure exists. Brian turned from the console, looked at Rebecca. He didn't say "I told you." He didn't say anything about the morning. He didn't take the moment for himself. He just said, "We're going to need a full security audit. Third party. Soon, I know," Rebecca said. "And the authentication relay that was compromised, it needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, not patched." "Rebuilt, I know." He nodded once, then he turned back to the screens. Because the crisis was contained, but contained wasn't the same as finished. And he wasn't the kind of man who stood up before the work was done. Rebecca stood at the edge of the room and watched him work. She had arrived at Nova Bridge Financial that morning, certain she knew what leadership looked like. She was learning something different now, something she hadn't been able to read in any report or find in any audit. Something that was only visible when a room full of smart, capable people hit the edge of what they could do. And one person who had never once made himself visible walked in and showed them what the ceiling actually was. She stayed until the end, not because she had to, because she was learning, and she had the specific humbling clarity of someone who understands for the first time exactly how much they don't know. The emergency review was called at 4:45, not suggested, called. Rebecca sent the calendar invite herself, with a one-line description that told everyone who received it exactly what kind of meeting this was going to be. Incident review full attendance required no exceptions. By 5 o'clock, the main conference room on the executive floor held 12 people, department heads, the CTO, Franklin Briggs, the board's technical liaison, a quiet man named Stephen Scott who had flown in from the Chicago office 3 weeks ago for the transition and had not yet gone home, the head of legal, the head of client relations, George White, who had been asked to attend and had said very little since receiving the request, and Brian Thompson, sitting at the far end of the table, still in the shirt he had changed into at his apartment. No badge, his hadn't been reissued yet. He had a cup of coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched. Rebecca sat at the head of the table. She had asked her assistant to prepare the incident summary. It was thorough, 4 pages, chronological. It began 2 days ago, when Brian first noticed the irregular pattern in the enterprise payment logs, and it ended 47 minutes ago, when the authentication layer restabilized and the intrusion pathway was confirmed closed. Every person in the room received a copy as they sat down. Nobody spoke while they read. The silence had a particular quality. The quality of people encountering facts that don't arrange themselves into a comfortable shape, no matter which way you turn them. The facts were these. Brian Thompson had identified a sophisticated intrusion into Nova Bridge's payment infrastructure 2 days before any automated system detected it. He had reported it through proper channels and been effectively told to wait. He had worked for 48 consecutive hours, without authorization for overtime, without additional resources, without a single colleague who fully understood what he was doing to keep the company's core systems operational. And the attack contained. He had left written documentation of everything, including an explicit warning about the restart trigger, in a location accessible to the entire technical team. He had been terminated before he could brief the incoming CEO. His warning had been read and not acted on. The restart had been executed. The result had been exactly what he predicted. The financial exposure was still being calculated. Preliminary numbers suggested potential liability in the range of $4 to $6 million, manageable, but not trivial. 2 enterprise clients had already requested formal incident explanations under the terms of their service agreements. The security audit that was now mandatory would cost time and money and attention that the company had not budgeted for. The catastrophic outcome, a large-scale diversion of corporate funds, followed by the kind of public disclosure that ends companies had been averted. Because Brian Thompson had come back, the room finished reading. A department head named Laura Clark, head of operations, 15 years with the company, set her copy down first. She looked at the table, then Franklin Briggs. The CTO cleared his throat. "I think what we're seeing here is a set of process failures that, taken together, created a cascade. Rebecca recognized the language before the sentence was finished. She had used it herself. In other rooms, in other companies. The language that organizations reach for when they want to account for what happened without making any single person too visible inside the accounting. Process failures. Communication gaps. Understandable given the circumstances. Language that spreads responsibility thin enough that it disappears. She had understood the function of that language for years. She understood now that using it in this room would be a direct repetition of the failure that had produced this crisis. She stood up. The room went quiet. This morning, she said, I fired Brian Thompson before I had heard a single complete sentence from him. Her voice was level. She wasn't performing contrition. She wasn't performing strength. She was saying the true thing in the plainest language available to her. I made that decision in under 2 minutes, based on an image that confirmed what I had already decided to believe. I didn't ask what he was doing there. I didn't look at the screens he was sitting in front of. I didn't give him the 30 seconds it would have taken to say what he needed to say. She paused. I was wrong. My error came close to costing this company something that would not have been recoverable. And I am sorry to Brian. And in front of all of you, the room was very still. The particular stillness of a space where something true and costly has been said in plain language without decoration. Sten Scott. The board liaison looked at his copy of the incident report. Looked at Rebecca. Set the report down, Brian, at the far end of the table, gave a single small nod. He didn't perform forgiveness. He didn't accept the apology with visible warmth or arrange his expression into something that would make the room feel better. He received it the way you receive something heavy that you've been carrying, not with joy, not with ceremony. With the quiet of a man who has set something down not because it was resolved, but because continuing to hold it serves no one. Franklin Briggs did not finish his sentence about process failures. Nobody else reached for that language either. George White spoke next. He had been sitting near the middle of the table. He hadn't looked up much during the reading. The restart was my call, he said. Timothy told me. He told me Brian had said not to restart it. I made the decision anyway. He said it plainly. No hedging, no, but given what I knew at the time. He had been turning it over since 12:47 p.m. and he had arrived at the place where the only honest version was the simple one. I didn't understand why the instruction mattered. I should have asked. The room absorbed that. Laura Clark, head of operations, said, the escalation path failed. Brian reported to Victor Hayes. Victor told him to wait. That's not Brian's failure or Victor's failure in isolation, that's a structural problem. Middle management has too much ability to suppress upward reporting when the timing is inconvenient. Several people nodded. Stephen Scott spoke for the first time. I'd like to hear from Brian directly. If he's willing. Every head in the room turned toward the far end of the table. Brian looked at the board liaison. Then, at the room, he wasn't uncomfortable with the attention. He just didn't have any interest in performing for it. The attack was patient, he said. Whoever planned it took their time. They found a low visibility entry point and used it carefully. They weren't trying to crash the system, they were trying to redirect it. That's more sophisticated than what our monitoring was built to detect. He paused, drank some coffee. The first time he'd touched it, the infrastructure is old, not bad old. There's a difference. Old means it has history. History means there are layers that don't appear in current documentation. Those layers are where this attack found its foothold. And those layers are where I've been working for 9 years. What do we do about that going forward? Stephen Scott asked. I'll get to that, Brian said. He said it without arrogance. Just as a statement of sequence, he would get to it. There was an order to things, and this came before that. Right now, he said, the authentication layer is stable. The intrusion pathway is closed. But the secondary relay that was compromised needs to be rebuilt, not patched, rebuilt, and the full network needs a third-party security audit within 30 days. Independent firm. Not a firm that's worked with NovaBridge before. Franklin Briggs wrote something down. How long for the rebuild? Laura Clark asked. 3 weeks if we do it right. 6 days if we do it fast and introduce 3 new vulnerabilities. 3 weeks, Rebecca said. Not a question, Brian looked at her. 3 weeks, she nodded. The offer came the next morning. Rebecca had asked Brian to come in at 9, not to the executive floor, to a smaller conference room on the 3rd floor. the kind used for working sessions rather than formal presentations. 2 chairs, a table, coffee that was actually hot. She slid a folder across the table. He opened it. Inside, a title. Director of Infrastructure Security. A compensation figure that was substantially higher than his current salary, his former salary. Reporting structure that placed him 2 levels higher in the organization than he had been. A mandate to oversee all legacy infrastructure, security protocol, and technical risk assessment at an organizational level. She watched him read it. He read it completely. He didn't react to the numbers. He didn't react to the title. He closed the folder, set it back on the table between them. Before I sign anything, he said, I need 3 things. Rebecca had expected negotiation on the compensation. She had not expected this. Tell me, she said. Brian had thought about this carefully. He had thought about it, in fact, during the drive home the previous evening, sitting in traffic on I-71, with the adrenaline finally leaving his system and the exhaustion coming back in hard. He had thought about what this moment was worth. What a person does when they've been handed leverage they didn't seek and didn't want. He thought about the next person who would sit at that console. The next engineer who would notice something wrong and try to report it and get told to wait. The next person who would spend 48 hours holding something together alone and then get fired for falling asleep. He thought about what he would have needed. What would have changed things? First, he said, a revised escalation protocol. Any frontline engineer who identifies a security concern gets a direct path to executive leadership. In writing, with a response requirement. Not filtered through department heads who are worried about timing. Rebecca wrote it down. Second, mandatory shift rotation in the operations center. No single person can be designated as the primary on any critical system for more than 12 continuous hours. Structural. Not a suggestion built into scheduling protocol. She wrote that down too. Third, a formal policy protecting engineers who raise risk alarms from any professional penalty for doing so. No retaliation, no quiet reassignment, no performance review consequences for reporting something that turns out to be a false alarm. The cost of a false alarm is one wasted afternoon. The cost of a real alarm that doesn't get reported is what we had yesterday. He stopped. Rebecca looked at what she had written. She had expected a compensation negotiation, a title discussion, maybe a request for a larger team or a bigger budget. Instead, she had received 3 requests. Every one of them designed to protect the next person who would be in Brian's position. Not one of them designed to protect Brian himself. She understood what she was looking at. A man who had been handed a significant amount of institutional leverage and had chosen to spend it on policies that would prevent the next person from being destroyed the way he had almost been destroyed. Done, she said. All 3. I'll have legal draft the language today. I want to review the language before it's finalized, of course. He picked up the folder again. Looked at the title. One more thing. Not a condition, a request. Tell me. He was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of someone deciding whether to say something personal in a professional setting. He had spent 9 years not doing that. Old habits. My wife's name was Sarah, he said. She was a network security analyst. Some of the baseline security practices that are still running in Nova Bridge's legacy systems came from conversations we had before she got sick. She helped me think through some of the early authentication architecture. Rebecca didn't move, didn't interrupt. I'm not asking for anything formal. Just I'd like her name acknowledged, somewhere. In the security documentation, or in the audit report, a line. Something that says she was part of this. The conference room was very quiet. Rebecca set her pen down. I'll make sure of it, she said. Brian nodded. Small. Once, he picked up the folder, signed the offer letter with the pen Rebecca slid across the table, placed it back in the folder, slid it back to her. 3 weeks for the relay rebuild, he said. I'll have a project plan by Friday. Friday works, she said. He stood, picked up his coffee. At the door he paused. The escalation protocol, he said. Make sure it applies retroactively. Anyone who got told to wait in the last 2 years, I want to know about it. He left without waiting for a response. Rebecca sat alone in the small conference room for a while. She looked at the signed offer letter, then at the 3 items she had written down. She had come to Nova Bridge Financial to change the culture. She was beginning to understand that the change she had been planning was a much smaller thing than the change she now understood was necessary. The security audit took 4 weeks. An independent firm out of Chicago, no prior relationship with NovaBridge, chosen specifically for that reason. 12 auditors, full access to every system layer. They produced a 200-page report that Brian read completely and annotated in the margins with a red pen, flagging the places where their conclusions matched his and the places where they had missed something. There were 6 places where they had missed something. He wrote the corrections up and submitted them to the lead auditor, who called him 2 days later and spent 45 minutes asking questions. The relay rebuild took 22 days. Brian managed it personally. It came in on time and under the original cost estimate. The escalation protocol was drafted by legal, reviewed by Brian over 2 evenings, revised in 4 places, and signed into company policy on a Thursday morning with no ceremony. Just a policy document added to the employee handbook and an all-hands email from Rebecca explaining what it meant and why it existed. 3 engineers came to Brian's office in the weeks following. Each of them had a story, something they had noticed and reported and been told to wait on. One was from 8 months ago, one was from a year and a half, one was from 3 years back, a junior engineer who was now not so junior, who had noticed something in the payment reconciliation layer and raised it and been quietly told that it wasn't the right time. Brian sat with each of them, listened, passed the relevant information to the security auditors and to Rebecca. 2 of the 3 concerns turned out to be real vulnerabilities. Not active exploits, but gaps. Places where the architecture had a weakness that someone patient could have used. Both were addressed in the rebuild. The third turned out to be a configuration quirk that was unusual but harmless. Brian explained why to the engineer who had raised it. He thanked him for raising it anyway. The engineer said, "I thought I was going to get in trouble for bringing it up." Brian looked at him for a moment. "You would have," he said, "before last Tuesday. You wouldn't now." Rebecca changed, not in the dramatic, declarative way of people who announce their transformations. In the quieter, more durable way of people who have been shown something they can't unsee. Her decisiveness remained. She still made decisions quickly when decisions were needed. Her standards stayed high. The accountability she had come to build was real. It just looked different now than the version she had arrived with. She slowed down in the moments that required listening. That was the most visible shift. The people who worked closely with her noticed it first. She started arriving in departments not to inspect but to ask questions. And she had learned through a crash course. She had not enrolled in voluntarily how to ask the kind of questions that made people feel safe enough to answer. Honestly, she began to recognize, with increasing reliability, the difference between the person who talked loudly about what they were doing and the person who was quietly holding something essential together. Those 2 types had always existed in every organization she had worked in. She had always been better at seeing the first type. That skill had nearly destroyed a company. In a meeting 6 weeks after the incident, a junior analyst named Kimberly Taylor raised a concern about a data integrity issue in one of the client reporting systems. She raised it hesitantly, the kind of hesitation that comes from not knowing whether the room will receive what you're saying or dismiss it. Rebecca stopped the meeting, not dramatically. She just set down her pen and said, "Tell me more about that." Kimberly looked briefly surprised. Then she explained the issue turned out to be small. A formatting inconsistency in one reporting field that would have caused minor discrepancies in quarterly client statements. A few hours of work to correct. No significant consequence, but the people in that room watched their CEO stop a meeting about strategic planning to listen completely to a junior analyst about a data formatting issue, and something shifted, not in the meeting, in the building. These things travel without memos. George White requested a meeting with Brian 3 weeks after the incident. Brian agreed to it. They sat in Brian's new office, larger than his old one, with a window, and George said what he had been trying to find the language for since the afternoon of the restart. "I've been in this building for 11 years, George said. "I thought I knew how to read a situation." "You read the situation you had been taught to read," Brian said. "That's not the same thing. I dismissed what Timothy told me. Yes, that's going to stay with me." Brian looked at him. "Good, it should. That's not me punishing you, that's how people learn the things that matter. The ones that cost something." George was quiet. "What do you want from me?" he said. "Going forward, Come to the protocol training next month. Not because you have to, because you want to understand why the new procedures exist. Bring your supervisors. Be someone who takes it seriously. That's it? That's everything, Brian said. George nodded. He stood. At the door he paused the way people pause when they've said most of what they needed to say and have one thing left. I'm sorry I didn't listen to Timothy. I know, Brian said. Tell Timothy. George left. He told Timothy that afternoon. They were standing at the coffee station on the operations floor. George said it simply, without preamble, and Timothy nodded and didn't know what to say, which was fine because it wasn't a conversation that required a resolution. It required only being said. Timothy went back to his station. He had been assigned to Brian's infrastructure team 3 weeks ago, his request. He was learning the legacy systems from the ground up. Brian gave him access to 9 years of working notes and told him to ask questions whenever he didn't understand something. Timothy asked a lot of questions. Brian answered all of them. On a Thursday evening, 5 weeks after everything, Brian came home at 6:30. Nicole was at the kitchen table. Homework done, she had gotten faster at the long division, now that she wasn't avoiding the hard step. Biscuit was propped against the fruit bowl, watching the room with the patient authority of a stuffed animal who has been everywhere and seen everything. Brian set down his bag, washed his hands, sat across from her. Good day? He asked. Medium, she said. We had a substitute in math and she did the examples wrong on the board and nobody told her. Did you tell her? Nicole considered this. I wrote the right answer in my notebook and showed Emma. That's something. She had very confident handwriting, Nicole said. The substitute. It seemed rude to say. Brian looked at his daughter for a moment. The particular look of a parent who is genuinely amused and trying not to show it enough to encourage her. How do you know what confident handwriting looks like? It's big, Nicole said, and it leans forward. He made dinner. Pasta this time. He had gotten slightly better at cooking in the past several weeks, motivated by a conversation with Nicole in which she had pointed out, with complete gentleness, that they had eaten scrambled eggs 11 Tuesdays in a row. They ate together. Nicole talked about a project her class was starting, something about local history. She needed to find out about Columbus in the 1800s. The library has books about that, Brian said. I know. I'm going to look it up on Saturday. Can we go? Yes. Can we get the donuts? We can get the donuts after. Nicole nodded, satisfied. She picked up Biscuit and straightened the rabbit's slightly bent ear, which immediately bent back. She had stopped trying to fix it permanently. She just straightened it every now and then and accepted that it would return to where it wanted to be. After dinner, Brian sat at the kitchen table while Nicole did her reading. He had a project plan open on his laptop, the post-audit remediation schedule, 60 items, color-coded by priority. He worked through it slowly, making notes, thinking about sequencing. At some point, Nicole padded over in her socks and leaned against his arm without asking. He moved the laptop slightly to make room. She looked at the screen. Is that the work stuff? Yeah. Is it better now? He thought about it. Honestly, the way he answered her questions, always not the simplified version, the real one in words she could hold. It's getting better, he said. It's not finished yet, but it's getting better. She nodded, went back to her book. Brian looked at the project plan, looked at the door to Nicole's room, looked at Biscuit propped against the fruit bowl. He thought about Sarah. He did that less frequently now than he had in the first year after she died, and with less of the sharp quality it used to have. It had become something quieter, a presence rather than an absence. She had been methodical and patient and precise, and she had looked at problems the way you look at puzzles, not with frustration, but with interest. Where does this go wrong? And what does that tell you about where it should go? He had learned more from her than from any system he had ever worked on. He had asked Rebecca to put her name in the documentation. Rebecca had done it. In the final security audit report, in the section acknowledging the legacy architecture foundations, there was a line. Several baseline authentication protocols in the Nova Bridge legacy system were developed in part by Sarah Thompson, network security analyst, whose contributions to the system's foundational design remain integral to its current operation. One sentence. Brian had read it 4 times. The following Friday, Rebecca was in the main lobby at 5:45. She had been in back-to-back meetings since 9 in the morning and was heading to the parking structure on autopilot. Her mind still sorting through the last conversation she'd had a budget discussion with the CFO that had run 30 minutes over. She saw Brian near the lobby entrance. He was crouched down, adjusting the strap on a small backpack. Nicole was standing in front of him, talking at speed, the specific velocity of a 7-year-old who has been saving something up all day and has finally found her audience. Her hands moved as she talked. Biscuit was under her arm. Brian was not half listening. He was entirely there, adjusted the strap without looking at it, his eyes on Nicole's face, tracking what she was saying with complete attention. Whatever had happened that day, the audit follow-ups, the relay rebuild status meeting, the call with the security firm's lead partner that had gone 40 minutes long, none of it was on his face. His face was soft, open, lit in a way that had nothing to do with professional competence or institutional knowledge or any of the things that had made him so important to the building he was standing in. He was a father at the end of a day. That was all. Rebecca stopped walking. She stood back and didn't approach. She had learned something in the weeks since the crisis, one of the smaller lessons, but real. The moments that belong to other people, how to recognize them, how to let them be. She watched for a moment. Nicole said something that made Brian almost laugh. The almost law he did when something landed squarely and he wasn't going to fully give himself away. He responded. Nicole disputed whatever he said with considerable energy. He listened to the dispute seriously. Rebecca reached into the pocket of her jacket. Her hand found something she had been carrying for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. She had found it in her coat pocket on the Monday morning after the incident, tucked into the lining, where it had been invisible until her hand found it by accident. She had pulled it out and stood in her apartment entryway looking at it for a full minute before understanding how it had gotten there, the chaos of the apartment. Nicole, standing nearby, watching a stranger in her living room, prepared to take her father back to the thing that had been taking him for 2 days. At some point during that confusion, quietly and without asking, Nicole had put Biscuit in the visitor's pocket. Rebecca had meant to return it sooner. She had been carrying it for 2 weeks, and somehow the moment had never been right, or she had been in a hurry, or she had told herself she'd do it tomorrow. She walked toward them. Brian looked up when he heard her approach. He stood. Nicole turned. Nicole's face, when she saw what Rebecca was holding, did something immediate and complete, the kind of delight that hasn't learned to be managed yet. She crossed the distance in 2 steps and took Biscuit with both hands, tucking the rabbit under her arm with the satisfaction of recovering something genuinely important. "I've been looking for you," she told Biscuit, in a tone that was both accusatory and forgiving. Rebecca looked at Brian. He looked back at her. There was no tension left in it, not the careful neutrality of 2 people who had reached a professional understanding, not the warm performance of people who wanted the moment to look a certain way. Just 2 people who had come through the same difficult thing from opposite directions, and had arrived, unexpectedly, at a version of seeing each other that neither of them had planned for. "Thank you," Brian said. 2 words. Simple thank you, Rebecca said. They both knew she wasn't talking about the same thing he was talking about. Nicole had already moved on. She was showing Biscuit the lobby, the tall windows, the plant by the security desk, the elevator doors that reflected if you stood close enough. Conducting a tour for an audience of 1, Brian watched her for a moment. "She put it in your pocket," he said. "I didn't know until after, I figured," Rebecca said. "She's very quiet about it. She's quiet about most things." "Then you find out," Rebecca smiled. Small. Real. Brian looked at Nicole, back at Rebecca. He had the expression of a man who has processed a great deal in a short amount of time and is no longer carrying most of it, not because it had been resolved, but because some things don't need to be carried forever. Some things can be set down when they're done. "Project plan is on track," he said. "Friday update, I saw it," she said. "It's good work," he nodded. Nicole had circled back. She stood between them, Biscuit under her arm, looking from one adult to the other with the assessing calm she brought to most things. "Are you the one who came to our house?" she asked Rebecca. "I am," Rebecca said. Nicole considered this. "You woke Daddy up." "I did." Another moment of consideration. "That was the right thing," Nicole said finally, with the particular confidence of someone delivering a verdict they've been thinking about for a while. Brian looked at the ceiling briefly. "Come on, Bug," he said. "Library's open until 7, and donuts after. That's tomorrow, I know." I'm just confirming. They moved toward the door. Brian paused once, a brief look back over his shoulder, not at the building. At Rebecca. She raised a hand. Small wave. He nodded. The real nod, not the professional one. Then the door opened, and they were outside in the late afternoon, a man and his daughter, and a stuffed rabbit with a bent ear, heading toward a library, doing the ordinary thing that ordinary evenings are made of. There are things that get written down after something like this: incident reports, policy documents, audit findings, revised org charts with new boxes and new reporting lines, legal summaries for the board, client notification letters with careful language and careful signatures, all of it real. All of it necessary. All of it the formal shape that institutions give to events that are too large and too messy to exist without some kind of frame. But the things that actually changed, the ones that mattered, were not in any document. They were in the way the building ran. They were in Timothy Clark, who had started asking one more question before accepting an answer that didn't feel right. Not loudly, not confrontationally, just one more question. He had learned that from Brian without Brian teaching it. He had watched how Brian worked and absorbed the habit the way you absorb habits from people who do things correctly. They were in the three engineers who had come forward with old concerns and found someone who listened. Two of them had been carrying those concerns for over a year, certain that raising them would cost them something. Now they knew different. That knowledge would travel. They were in George White, who had attended the protocol training in November with his full team, not because he was required to, because Brian had said, "Come, because you want to understand why." He had sat in the back row and taken notes with the specific attention of a man who has seen what it costs to not understand. They were in Nicole Thompson, who didn't know any of this, but whose father came home at 6:30 most evenings now, not because he worked less, but because the structure had been built to prevent the situation where one person carries everything alone until they break. She didn't know that the policy her father had written was the reason for this. She just knew he was there. That was enough for her. They were in Sarah Thompson's name. One sentence in a 200-page audit report. A name that would have been lost, entirely swallowed into the anonymous history of a system that outlived the person who helped build it, sitting now in official documentation. Permanent, legible, true. Brian came across it again in December, when he was reviewing the final audit report for a board presentation. He was alone in his office. It was late. The floor was quiet. He read the sentence, looked out the window at Columbus at night, the ordinary lights of an ordinary city doing ordinary things. He thought about Sarah, about what she would have said about all of this. She would have had opinions about the authentication rebuild. She would have found at least one place where his approach was less elegant than it could be and told him so, kindly, specifically, in a way that made it impossible to argue with. She would have liked Nicole's verdict in the lobby. That was the right thing. She would have found it conclusive. He sat in the quiet office for a while. Then he closed the report, turned off the desk lamp, and went home. Rebecca stayed late more often than she should have. She was aware of this. She was working on it, on one of those late evenings, sitting in her office with the city spread out below her and a budget forecast open on her screen. She thought about her grandfather. Donald Thomas had called her 3 weeks after the incident. He had read the board summary. He hadn't said much. He was not a man who used more words than necessary. He had asked, "Did you learn something?" "Yes," she said. "Was it expensive?" "Good," he said. "The cheap lessons don't stick." He had hung up. That was the whole conversation. She sat with that for a moment and then unexpectedly laughed. Small, real. He was not wrong. She had spent 3 years proving she could earn things the hard way. In rooms where people expected her to fail. She had done that. And she had walked into Novabridge Financial and, on her first morning, let 9 years of someone else's hard-won knowledge get escorted out the front door because she'd been too certain to look. The expensive lesson. It had cost the company $4 million in liability exposure, 2 client relationships that needed rebuilding, and 30 days of remediation work. It had cost Brian Thompson a morning he would not forget. It had cost her something harder to quantify, a version of certainty she had relied on for years and would never fully rely on again. She was not sure that was entirely a loss. The skill she had paid to acquire the ability to slow down in the moment before a decision and ask what she might be missing was not a skill she had possessed on that first morning. It was not a skill you could read yourself into. It was a skill you had to earn by being wrong in a way that showed you exactly how wrong could be. She was learning to use it. A man had been publicly diminished in the building where he had given 9 years of himself. He had been publicly restored in the same building, before many of the same people. That restoration did not undo the diminishment. It didn't pretend to. It just existed alongside it, two true things at once, which is how most true things live. A woman had arrived with certainty and left the morning's first hour with less of it. She had spent the weeks since learning to lead in a different key. Not softer, not less decisive, just different, with a question underneath the decision. With a slowing down built into the speed, a child had tucked a stuffed rabbit into a stranger's pocket in the middle of chaos. She had not done it for any reason a 7-year-old would have been able to name. She had just done it the way children sometimes do things that are inexplicably correct, out of instinct or kindness, or some small wisdom that hasn't been argued out of them yet. It had come back. The things that matter have a way of doing that. Not always, not on a schedule, not in the shape you expect. But sometimes in a lobby on a Friday afternoon, in the ordinary light of an ordinary autumn, with a little girl telling a stuffed rabbit about everything it missed, the thing comes back. And that is enough. That is sometimes exactly enough.